Hey, well, it's 5:31. I want to go ahead and get started so we can get to everything we wanted to discuss. Good evening to everyone who is joining us for our Seven Starling webinar series designed to give you, healthcare providers across specialties, pearls to help you feel more confident in supporting your patients with mood and anxiety disorders across the reproductive lifespan of people. I am Dr. Nazanin Homofar, and I'm a board certified OB-GYN practicing in Northern Virginia and the medical director at Seven Starling. Seven Starling is a virtual mental health clinic that treats those experiencing anxiety, depression, and trauma throughout fertility challenges, pregnancy loss and miscarriage, abortion, and postpartum. I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Susan Feingold. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, perinatal legal advocate, and author. She's also a co-recipient of the 2018 Maternal Mental Health Innovation Award in Policy and Advocacy. Dr. Feingold and Attorney Lewis shepherded the first postpartum criminal law in the nation through the Illinois legislature, and it became law in 2018, and we'll hear more about that experience today. That case has led the two of them to work in helping other states introduce postpartum criminal legislation. And as a specialist in the field for more than 30 years in women's reproductive mental health, Dr. Feingold is also an accomplished author and speaker and serves on the Postpartum Support International Advisory Council and as a maternal mental health advisor to Seven Starling. Dr. Feingold, there was so much more, but I had to shorten the bio a little bit. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are taking a slightly different path in our webinar today and highlighting the role of the perinatal mental health expert in the courtroom. First and foremost, Dr. Feingold, you're a clinical psychologist. I would love for us to start with how did you end up getting involved with legislation and advocacy, and where has this journey led you?
It's such a good question to start with. So I've been at this point a specialist in perinatal mental health for over 30 years. But in 2017, I had received an email from Postpartum Support International coming through them that they were looking for someone to testify in Springfield, our state capital, on a postpartum psychosis depression bill that was being discussed and going to be voted on. And I volunteered. Be careful what you volunteer for.
Little did you know that one.
Exactly. It's so funny. It's like sometimes the door opens that you never expected. So I just expected I would just do that one thing. And so I, drove to Springfield and I testified on that bill. And there was discussion and it passed that day and it went on to the Senate subcommittee from the House subcommittee, and that's sort of the process. I eventually learned the process because I had not been involved in this legislation aspect before. And then there was opposition, and my partner, who's a criminal defense attorney many years, got involved, or maybe I sort of pulled him in. He volunteered then, and the two of us started working together. We both testified in the Senate, and then there were various obstacles along the way. And we really shepherded that bill through the Illinois legislature. And as you said, it became law in 2018, not only the law in Illinois, but the first postpartum psychosis and depression criminal law in the US.
Wow.
And so that sort of changed it certainly changed really probably for both of us, but I'll speak for myself. It changed the course, not only of my career, but my passion to work in this area. And so what was so amazing is that two women inmates who had been in prison for over 2 decades at that time had written this legislation from prison. They both had life sentences with no parole,
Wow.
and one had postpartum psychosis, the other did not, Sims and Jackson, and they should get all the credit. And then, we were able to shepherd this law through. But then in 2021, because of the passage of the law, Sims was allowed had a clemency hearing. And again, I volunteered and I was an expert witness at her clemency hearing, which, we'll probably get to talk
Yeah.
about a little bit. And she had been in prison for 32 years following postpartum psychosis, in which unfortunately there was a tragedy of taking the life of her two children, two
Mhm.
daughters, and she was released the next day. And Paula has been out for almost 2 years now. We talk almost daily. And she's doing
That's
some
amazing.
amazing advocacy herself, working on prison reform and justice issues. So, yeah.
I
So
mean, I would love to. You briefly talked about this, you mentioned this legislation, you mentioned
Mhm.
Sims. Tell us a little bit more about this law in Illinois that you helped pass, what it accomplished, and what you learned in the process.
I would love to do that. The other thing that I didn't say before I go into that is that following the Illinois law, it has led to many presentations and helping other states. Massachusetts, we've been able to lend our support and help in Massachusetts, who has filed as of April a comprehensive postpartum depression psychosis legislation that includes treatment and prevention, and more recently, Colorado. So the Illinois law, getting to your question, has a very, very sexy name. It's called Illinois PA 100-0574.
Really memorable, really
Very
memorable.
memorable. Yes, it's sort of in my brain though. So it's the first, as I said, the first law in the country and in Illinois. And this law amended the Code of Corrections to basically consider postpartum depression and psychosis mitigating factors when women commit these crimes because
What
of mental illness.
what does that mean to be a mitigating factor?
It means that in my non-law practice, basically that it reduces the sentence. That
Okay.
yes, can lighten the sentence. So is my understanding. And then in 2019, that law was amended and had another interesting name, which is PA 1010411. And
Okay.
that provided relief from judgment and mitigation, allowing women who are already incarcerated in the past, so it's retroactive, to have an opportunity for a resentencing hearing under certain stipulations, that their
Wow.
postpartum illness was not diagnosed or treated properly when they were charged and when they were on trial. So it accomplished that. So the law really pertains to past, present, and future cases. And with that law, Paula was able to get out, as well as many other women.
I remember when we were prepping for this webinar, you were telling me a little bit about how the judicial system treated these women in the past. Tell our audience a little bit more. I mean, we were talking about, like in Sims's case, women who are accused of these horrific crimes, but under very specific circumstances of mental health, are called monsters. And so many
Absolutely.
more things. Tell us a little bit about what
Absolutely.
what you were seeing, how you were seeing the judicial system treat these women, and how this law has helped change that. You mentioned briefly.
Yes. So, how we treat women is very harshly. Many of these women get more severe sentences than hardened criminals or mass murderers. This is considered the low of the low, and they're often called baby killers and monsters. And some of us who've worked on their behalf are called some of those names as well, that were lovers of monsters and baby killers. And these women get it's a difficult situation because they have a harder time getting an insanity defense, many of these women, and that's what we talked about ourselves, because oftentimes they have no mental health history. That
Right.
until they have a baby, these aren't people that have a long criminal history, and they aren't
Right.
people sometimes that have a mental health history. We know that 50% of the women that get postpartum psychosis have no mental health history. So
I mean,
until
sorry,
they,
I just want to pause. That's a really poignant part of this. Like 50% of women who will develop postpartum psychosis have no history.
and no idea that
Right.
this is
Yeah.
coming.
And we're going to talk in a little bit about postpartum psychosis. We'll touch on that. But um, yeah, you were saying that they have the hardest time with the insanity defense because they don't have this history.
Correct. So it puts them at a disadvantage. It's often considered that it's malingering, they're faking, um,
Hmm.
using this as an excuse. And really, who goes through a whole pregnancy and plans on having a baby to take the baby's life? So these women are blindsided. Often they have no idea what's coming. And then the interesting thing is this is a temporary mental illness, and with treatment, it's very treatable. People get well and go on and live their life. But for these women that unfortunately commit these crimes, this changes their life. It changes their whole family, this tragedy. And in the United States, many of these women spend the rest of their life in prison, or in some states, they get the death penalty. In Europe, there are over 30 countries that have these laws. And it all started with the British Infanticide Act in 1938, because in the UK, and now maybe it's more like 37 countries, they accept that within 12 months of delivery, a woman who takes the life of her child is mentally ill and they need
Wow.
treatment, not to spend their life in prison. So, yeah, so I'm, very passionate about working in changing this and changing the system.
It sounds like, I mean, thankfully, it sounds like outside of the US and at least what we know from Europe, there's a lot more compassion towards women's
Absolutely.
mental health, and we have a ways to go. Tell us a little bit on the legislation side. I mean, you helped pass laws, and going in as an expert, what were you noticing about the people who are in charge of making the laws around these things?
Yes. So, I think when, in testifying and also, in testifying in both the House, the Senate, the subcommittees, and I also have presented to the a judicial committee in Massachusetts, is they don't really understand maternal mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean,
so I'm sorry.
no, I'm not surprised,
Oh, okay.
but,
Yes.
but
So, yeah. And so part of our role as an expert is to educate and to educate, the public, but also those in the legal system and in the healthcare system as well, so that people can identify this and these women don't have to go down this path, that they get treatment, because particularly with postpartum psychosis, they need to be hospitalized for their own safety and the safety of their children and family and other people, because of what the symptoms are.
right. And well, before we get to those symptoms, did you have any moments when you were speaking to the legislatures where you just noticed maybe a light bulb go off, or there was an aha moment? What was the biggest learning that you think you imparted on the legislature that you worked with?
Mm. Um, It's such a good question. I mean, I almost have to think about it. There were several moments. I think there was one moment when Barry and I testified in the Senate, that one of the senators, because there was opposition, said to the state's attorney lobbyist, "Are you?" He was going on about how this is unconstitutional and we shouldn't do it and all this other stuff. And basically, this senator, like, he had a light bulb and he said, "Are you telling me we can't change a known wrong? That we can't change something wrong in the law?" And then we knew we had it. And then they took the vote and it passed.
Wow. Wow. How incredible. Tell me, Susan, you just, Dr. Feingold, you just highlighted the fact that
Oh,
legislators or those in the judicial system had a lot to learn about the perinatal mental health and postpartum psychosis. And I would say, like, the same is true of the medical field, really. I mean, I'm an OB-GYN, and it took my work with Seven Starling to really learn more about it. We hosted a webinar with Dr. Crystal Clark a few months ago about postpartum psychosis. Can you briefly share some facts that we should know about postpartum psychosis?
absolutely. I would love to. So, and I'll try to keep it brief because I know we're on the clock, we're on a time limit. So I mean, the first thing, as I had said, it is a temporary mental illness. It's the most severe of the maternal mental illnesses that can come following, with a pregnancy or postpartum. And that's why we often call it perinatal now. But in terms of postpartum psychosis, we know that 1 to 2 out of 1,000 women following childbirth can get this illness. And again, 50% of those women had no mental health history, so they were really unaware. But we do know that there is a link to bipolar disorder. That's not to say that every woman who has bipolar disorder gets postpartum psychosis, but they're certainly more at risk. So that's one thing to know. The other thing is that in addition to the women that we say have postpartum psychosis, there is always a possibility, and we need to look at this as well, that someone can have a severe postpartum depression and can start to develop, because of the severity, if it's not treated, that they can start to develop psychotic symptoms and become psychotic. So it's not only this group who usually postpartum psychosis presents very early on following delivery and shows a lot of sort of the mania and not needing to sleep and don't sleep for days, which are some of the symptoms. But in addition, we want to watch, we really want to watch everyone because all these illnesses are very, very treatable,
Mm.
postpartum psychosis as well. But some of the symptoms include impaired thinking and judgment and behavior and reasoning and impaired reality testing. So that these women start having hallucinations where they might hear voices or see things that aren't there, or have delusions, which means strange beliefs like their
Mhm.
baby is the Messiah or their baby is Satan, or they're hearing messages from the TV set. The
Yeah.
other thing that is a symptom of postpartum depression that makes it harder for the judicial system, and really why sometimes many women fall between the cracks, is this illness tends to wax and wane, meaning symptoms can come and go.
Right.
So you can imagine when, a prosecutor, when a woman has taken the life of her baby and then they're exploring it and they get the neighbor who talked to her the day before and she seemed perfectly fine,
Right.
and then she comes home and she starts seeing things that aren't there, or believing that she needs to take the life of this baby to save the baby, and there's all kinds of crazy stories.
Yeah.
So those are some of the symptoms. The other thing that's, oh, I'm sorry.
No, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
The other thing that's really, I think, a couple other facts to know is that we know that women are 23 times more likely to get psychosis, to become psychotic in the month following childbirth than at any other time of their life. If they're going to become psychotic, they're at their highest risk within a month of childbirth. And in addition, two other facts I'd like to leave you with, besides the fact that these women need to, again, it's a clinical emergency, they need to be hospitalized for their own safety, is the risk. So what we know is 4 to 5% of the women that have postpartum psychosis commit suicide. So it's not only taking the life of their child, and 1 to 4% commit infanticide or filicide, taking the life of a child, their child. Usually, or stepchild, I guess it could be, but what that says is the majority with postpartum psychosis do not do these things, but they can, because they're not, their judgment's impaired, their thinking's impaired, their
Right.
reality is impaired. They're not themselves.
I think, I think this might have to be for another talk because you're right. When you do recognize this, I've seen this in some message boards amongst colleagues, and I've experienced this through other colleagues too, that even if you do think, because it waxes and wanes, when people are reaching out for help, they're they're running into dead ends because people are saying, well, they're fine right now, we can't do anything about it, we can't take them against their will right now because they seem to have good judgment. And I think that's a whole other discussion. Like what kind of information do you need to provide? How do you seek help? We already know that there are only a few facilities across the country that might be best equipped to help specifically women who are experiencing postpartum psychosis. But I think for the family members, there was a chat amongst the OB-GYN group today. There was an OB-GYN that had recognized postpartum psychosis in a loved one and felt like their hands were tied behind their back because the person was fine when anyone came to check on them.
That's such an important point. And, what occurs to me is even mental health providers, if they're not specialists in perinatal, sometimes they also might not have the facts and might miss something or not know how to treat it properly. So there is a difference in seeing someone who's a perinatal mental health provider, a specialist, than someone who's a generalist and maybe has never seen this before.
Right.
And yeah.
Tell me, Brie, I know we're almost out of time, but briefly, what are some of the shortcomings of the DSM as it relates to postpartum psychosis?
Hmm. Well, the main shortcoming is postpartum psychosis is not in the DSM. The
Ding, ding, ding.
DSM, the DSM, that's okay, is and of course, why would you know that? But the DSM, this is the mini version, is sort of the Bible of every kind of mental health problem you can have. It's the nomenclature, and it's the diagnostic, it stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And what happens is, because postpartum psychosis is not in the DSM, a smart prosecutor, when a woman comes to court and then somebody testifies on her behalf to say she has postpartum psychosis, and they say that does not exist. It is not in the DSM. And this puts women at disadvantages. And so therefore, not only do we need to pass laws in every state, but we need to have postpartum psychosis in the DSM. And one of my esteemed colleagues, Meg Spinelli, has been working on that for years. And it's not an easy battle to
Do
get
we
that.
have any do we have any sense that that is going to be added soon?
I hope so. I don't know. And I think that, again, some of the people that make the decisions on this don't work necessarily with maternal mental illness, and they're not necessarily well versed in that.
I know we have one question from the audience, and we'll get to that in a second. I wanted to end with just, what do you think I've taken away as an OB-GYN who sees patients in that postpartum period? I've taken away a lot of learnings. What would you advise OB-GYNs to consider as the biggest takeaways, given your perspective in the criminal courts and a woman's mental health therapist?
So, yeah, I took down a couple things, but I'm just going to highlight very few, since we don't have a whole lot of time. But I think it's really important to ask women, are you sleeping? Are you eating? How is your mood? To red flag women that do have a mental health history, a history of depression, panic, OCD, certainly bipolar disorder, because they're at the higher risk, and to be checking on them and monitoring them. OBs could also use the Edinburgh, which takes only 5 minutes to take and score. And they can have a nurse in their practice or someone else administer that postpartum, or just ask women. And, and do some education with their patients, letting them know that this is a possibility, but that hearing about it won't cause it to happen. But that if you experience any of these things and don't feel like yourself, call us.
Right.
And for OB-GYNs to have a referral source like Postpartum Support International, and if possible, perinatal mental health personnel that they can make referrals to, or Seven Starling.
I think the number of times I've seen my patients kind of make the connection when I ask them about past mental health history, and they say, "Oh yeah, I did in the past, but I'm fine now." For
Right.
me, that's a moment to take pause, because so often when we're seeing our patients, we don't have a lot of time. We're focusing on their health in the present, and Just like we would screen someone who had some elevated blood pressures for chronic hypertension or ask about a family history, the same is true of mental health. We need to encourage my colleagues to dig a little bit deeper and make sure you understand that history and help the patient um, understand that they're at a higher risk and need to be looking out for their mental health even more.
Yes, that's great.
How, the question from the audience was, what are ways, if any, to advocate for an expanded description and diagnosis from perinatal mental health disorders in the DSM?
Hmm. Can you repeat the question again?
What are ways, if
Mhm.
any, to advocate for an expanded description and diagnosis for perinatal mental health disorders in the DSM? Is there anyone we should be talking to?
Yes.
How do we
I mean,
influence?
I think certainly contacting Postpartum Support International, asking if you'd like to get involved. That might be one way, but even writing, um, I know at one point I wrote to the task force that was looking at the newest version, because every few years the DSM is updated, and encouraging them. And so I think if they hear from more people that it
Mhm.
is critical, these perinatal disorders, that's not just a specifier, which is what it is now. It'll say like someone has depression with a postpartum onset,
Okay.
that instead calling it by name. I think it legitimizes it. It will help a lot for these women who then have criminal cases, and I think it'll have healthcare providers and all of us taking it more seriously.
Absolutely.
It legitimizes it. So I think that would be very helpful. Certainly, you could also get in touch with Dr. Spinelli at Columbia University. Or always get in touch with me, and particularly if you'd like to advocate in your state and move legislation there, because we're so pleased that we've been asked to help in Colorado and getting that going, and in Massachusetts, and we're thrilled to help any state then, and kind of tell them what we've learned and help as we can.
Amazing. And to our audience member who asked that question, if you do end up writing a letter, please send it. I'm at Nazanin at Seven Starling so that we can circulate it and have more people send it
Wonderful.
out. If the audience member does that. Well, Dr. Feingold, this was such an illuminating conversation. I learned so much, and I thank you so much for sharing your experience and your advocacy with us today. And it's incredible work, and it sounds like it happened. There was a reason this call went out in 2017, and you answered it. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely, and to the providers who
All the
joined
all
us.
the viewers.
Yes, exactly. We hope you found these 30 minutes engaging and informative. And a reminder that we're seeing patients with Seven Starling in Texas, Virginia, Maryland, DC, New York, and now Nevada, and offer medication management in all of these locations, with Nevada forthcoming. We also accept many insurances, and for more information, you can respond to the newsletter or email at practices@sevenstarling.com. We're committed at Seven Starling to providing the full spectrum of women's mental health care, and would love to support you and your patients. So please check out our website, sevenstarling.com, to learn more about how we may help you in your practice. If you like this webinar, please subscribe to our newsletter so we can keep you informed about future events. Have a great night, everyone. Dr. Feingold, hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Great to see you.
Thanks.
Bye.